It's an intriguing thought that this unknown, troubled young dude was buried here, still here somewhere. All these crazy, high drama threads in the story. It is a story that has, it's been, as far as I know, it's been totally forgotten. And it happened right here in the tranquil boundary waters.
This episode of the podcast is supported in part by Sawtooth Outfitters that are located right off Highway 61 in Tofty. It's the holiday season, and Jeff and Sarah are going to be reopening December 26th. Sawtooth Outfitters have so much in the way of offerings for all of the winter recreation here across the Boundary Waters and the North Shore area. That's Sawtooth Outfitters, Highway 61 in Tofty. Find them online at their website as well and their social media pages. And thanks to Sawtooth Outfitters for supporting the podcast. Welcome to the Paddle and Portage Podcast. Today, we're going to head into the Boundary Waters.
The story actually starts at a coffee shop in Duluth. Joe Fredericks and I posted up working on some of the stories that we bring to you, and Joe mentions he's corresponding with a guy, Ryan Rodgers,
a writer in Duluth, and he published in the Boundary Waters Journal in the fall issue of 2024 an article about a story that took place on Pine Lake on the far east end of the wilderness. It involved murder, homicide, movement, history, people coming to what was not even then the Boundary Waters about a century ago. And there's so many twists and turns in the story, and it's written in this way that was not like a typical Boundary Waters Journal article. It was long and told so well, and it was like reading something from a book.
I sit there listening to Joe go on and on, as he does when excited about somebody's art and work. And eventually Joe interrupts my workflow again to let me know that Ryan can come down and meet us right now. What should I say? That's what you asked me. And I said, tell him to come down.
We were on our way to the Winter Camping Symposium, and we had stopped in Duluth to be on the TV station that night. And Ryan, I said, okay, I'll tell him to come down. Text, I'll be down. I'll be there in 20 minutes.
It's hard to know what to expect when you're meeting somebody who's an avid Boundary Waters traveler. You kind of have sorts of natural stereotypes in your head. The thing I did not expect was to see a man of relatively modest stature hobbling in on one crutch over to our corner, trying to get around stools and chairs, and with a little twinkle in his eye.
Could tell right away there was something to this individual, and sure enough there was. I mean, he had a kind of a mad scientist sort of look and vibe, glasses and curly hair, and
obviously a beard.
Yeah, scraggly beard, and it was just immediately he went into storyteller mode. I was captivated, hooked from the minute we sat down.
The result of that conversation at that coffee shop has been just a discovery of both the amazing talent and gifts that come out of Ryan's creativity and his writing and his research as a historian and storyteller, and also some incredible features that have been written for Paddle and Portage. And lastly, not lastly, but continually, today's episode.
That's right. So Ryan agreed to come up and paddle into Pine Lake with me, which is at the end of the Arrowhead Trail, where this story that he wrote for the Boundary Waters Journal is set. And he wanted to show me some of the places where that story takes place. It involves a gentleman at the centerpiece of it named Frank Kugler, who was an immigrant that came and tried to make a living off the land, basically, at Pine Lake in that area at the end of what's now called the Arrowhead Trail. And so with that in mind, Let's head into the Boundary Waters with Ryan Rodgers.
John Doe pulled up in the house after Kugler took off and killed himself on Kugler and Minnie's bed. And the sheriff brought a posse back with including a doctor who autopsied John Doe and, determined the cause of death. And according to Rutstrom, he was then buried on site where...
So Ryan's talking about a couple different people here, Frank Kugler and John Doe. Kugler is the person who came and lived on Pine Lake, built a cabin there right near the flow between McFarland and Pine. He's living this somewhat harmonious lifestyle, and this gentleman, legally known as John Doe, shows up one day, holds Kugler and his wife hostage at gunpoint, turns into a big scene, and then a couple weeks later, Kugler returns and shoots John Doe at the cabin. That's the story Ryan's talking about.
It makes sense they would have buried him here. They would have they walked up here. They're not going to drag a 170-pound corpse back to the shore. But how did they get him in the ground if there's still snow, unless somebody made a separate trip later to inter him? Or maybe this little knoll here melted out first, and this snow is more limited to lower areas.
And that somebody died by suicide, like right here on the portage. That's also an intriguing thought, you know?
And Kugler shot him twice. And John Doe evidently determined that he wasn't going to make it, that he was going to die from his wounds, which the doctor who autopsied him said that he wasn't going to die right away, but he would die in a few days if he did not get medical treatment. And as a wanted outlaw, Doe wasn't about to trek into town, I assume. So yeah, he decided to shoot himself in the head with the rifle he'd stolen from Kugler.
Right here and at this point here.
Yeah, in Kugler's cabin, which presumably we were walking around down there where the cornerstones were, and there was more significant structure.
So how'd you ever get started on this story?
I was searching through Calvin Rutstrom's papers at the St. Paul Historical Society looking for something else entirely, which I did not find there, but I did find this unpublished manuscript he'd written about Kugler in the late 1940s that had been sitting in his papers ever since he turned it over to the Historical Society.
Is that the first time you saw Kugler's name?
Well, after I started reading through it, I remembered reading about Kugler in one of Rutstrom's books, and I forget which one it is, but he describes his meeting with Kugler on Tom Lake back in 1924 when Rutstrom was taking his first trip to the Border Lakes canoe country, and he'd heard about this bad dude that he should avoid. But Rutstrom figured he had no personal issues with Kugler, so he'd be fine. And he did meet this guy that a shopkeeper in Grand Marais had warned him was trouble, and Rutstrom and him fell into a friendship. Rutstrom saw that Kugler was not dangerous, but he was lonely and reeling from being ostracized from the community and having been tried for murdering John Doe. Actually, he wasn't tried for murdering. It was first-degree assault, as I recall, because Doe, of course, because Doe had killed himself.
Pause everything for a second, because Ryan keeps mentioning this Rutstrom character, and I don't know who he is.
Right. So his name's Calvin Rutstrom, and he is an author. He came up here in the sort of era of Sig Olson or Oberholzer and those guys. He's an author who wrote about the Boundary Waters and paddling, and was a wilderness advocate before that was really much of a thing. But he's a guy. Cal Rutstrom's an author. There's actually a person with some connections to Cook County and the North Shore Boundary Waters region named Tor Torkelson, who is writing the biography right now of Cal Rutstrom. And I talked with Tor a little bit about Rutstrom. Who is he? Here's what Tor says.
Rutstrom was a corpsman in the Navy in World War I. and he was in the trenches, and his best friend was from Portage over there and in Europe. And he came back and he was so devastated by the war, so disgusted by humanity, that he just wanted to go and get away from everything. And this friend from Portage was always telling him what a wild place it was up here. And so he got on the America right after the war, and he got off the boat in Hovland, and he walked to Tom Lake on the old Tom Lake route there. And spent the night. Next day, he walked onward up to McFarland, and then he built a cabin up in there where you were. And so he did that. And then he decided to live a life in nature. So what Rutstrom would do, he'd work a couple months, 2-3 months, and then he would just go into the bush. And he was constantly trying to go wilder and wilder and wilder. And in fact, he ended up way up in Canada towards the end. But he had a special fondness for Hovland, and he bought some property along the Flute Reed. The cabin's still there on the property on North Road. What Rutstrom did is he just wanted to be out in nature. He'd bring supplies and a lot of books, and he'd just go out in the bush and just alone mostly, but he hung out with some other folks to learn skills. He started parceling off this properties along the Flute because the Flute was a great trout stream in its day. People came from all over, and so he was selling small parcels to live along the Flute, these little cabins. There's still a couple of them there. He started writing, and he started in his 50s publishing articles, and then he did a manual. He built a cabin up on Seagull Lake. He built a cabin up there. He was up there 10 years, wrote a manual, outdoor manual that's McMillan picked up. And all of a sudden there he was a writer. So they picked him up, and he proceeded to write 15 books and became a very well-known outdoorsman. He just had a fondness for this country up here. He spent time out in Montana as a young guy. At one point his wife said, "Can't we just go somewhere else but the Boreal?" And so he moved down to New Mexico, and I went down there and found his house in New Mexico. Raided it for a year, but he couldn't stay away, so he came back. He just loved the Boundary Waters and all that Boreal, and he just kept going north, building cabins, spending the winters out there, and hunting and trapping and reading a lot of books and writing.
Now that we've cleared up who Cal Rutstrom is, let's get back to Pine Lake in the Boundary Waters with Ryan Rodgers after this word from our sponsors.
I'm down here in Duluth right now, and I just got off the phone with Bob Carlson, the owner of Loon's Nest Coffee. It's located in the Mid-Gunflint Trail area. Bob and I were talking about a lot of different things. The year ahead, 2025, Canoe-copia, Bob's son going to college, all kinds of things. Also talk, though, about the fact you can order from the website right now to get some of their blend. Loon's Nest, the coffee shop itself on the Gunflint, is closed until next spring. Just a seasonal thing, but you can order from the website right now, as I just did, actually. After we wrapped up our conversation, got some of the Gunflint roast, the Gunflint blend that is available for order by the pound, the whole bean. Send it out as a Christmas gift, so keep that in mind if you're looking for some last-minute holiday shopping, or you just want to stock up and have it in store until they're ready to rock again for the 2025 paddling season up the Gunflint. Loon's Nest Coffee, that's the name of it on the Gunflint, and you can find it at carlsonroasting.com. So that sent you off on this journey to learn more.
Well, I'm always looking for a good excuse to take a canoe trip, and it was it's such a dramatic story. It just has all these layers. I've long liked Kelvin Rutstrom, so it's cool that he has this place in it. And Kugler's story itself is really interesting. This young Austrian immigrant looking for, he was pursuing the American dream. He wanted freedom from a government he felt was oppressive. He wanted freedom from the Catholic Church of his home country that he felt was oppressive. And he'd heard about the United States and how a person could hunt and support themselves in the wilds that still remained. And he he made a go for it, and he headed to the U.S. He was going to go to Alaska, and he wound up getting sidetracked in Duluth, where he decided he wanted to venture into the country a fur trapper had told him about. That happened in 1902. I believe he came to the U.S. in 1900. He traveled first to Nebraska. He worked for a while in a wood shop. He saved up money. He traveled to Colorado and then to California. He worked his way back east to Minnesota, and he talked to a trapper in Duluth, which must have been quite a different town in 1900. And this trapper told him about his own life living in the bush and trapping animals and selling furs, and Kugler was sold. Even though he'd never canoed before, he decided, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to head up the shore to Grand Marais and Hovland and head inland to where there are few people and sufficient animals that I can, in theory anyway, make a living from trapping. Which he did, kind of remarkably. He didn't have any experience in it. And, something that also I thought was interesting is that, he didn't know English, I'm sure, when he arrived in the U.S., and he learned that fairly quickly, enough to converse by this trapper in 1902. And after he'd moved to Pine Lake, he also quickly learned Ojibwe mowing, which, again, he was obviously a bright guy. And he built his cabin right near where we are now and lived there for quite a few years. Let's see, from 1902, 1903 until 1919 when when John Doe invaded his home.
To spend time out in the woods with a writer, historian, somebody who's so passionate about the Boundary Waters like Ryan Rodgers, that, for me, became the story. I was interested in Kugler and John Doe and the whole history of it. But what really grabbed my attention was how spirited Ryan was in talking about the past, the history of this land, the history of the Boundary Waters.
After he was tried for murder, his wife would no longer live here at the cabin. She'd had an awful experience. The experience had led to severe health problems that almost caused her to die. And she was done. She was done with this bush living. So Kugler built them a home in Hovland, and he still would travel up here to run his trap line for some years after, which was when he met Rutstrom in 1924, 5 years after his trial. And yeah, he lived out his days in Hovland. Kugler wrote to Rutstrom that Minnie's death was directly caused by what had happened with John Doe. And I was never clear how that played out, because she had frostbit her feet on the escape through the snow, and then she had this horrible gangrene in the coming months. So Minnie died after a few years, and Kugler married again, and he had a gardening and plant nursery at his place in Hovland, and he did become a Cook County commissioner in, I want to say, the late 30s. He held that post for a while. He had other county posts as well during the, I believe, late 30s and 40s, and he died in 1950.
And so what has this experience been like for you to share this story with the world and do this research?
Well, it's an appealing story on many different fronts. You have the the sort of American dream of Kugler, which saw some success, but it also, in other ways, was a failure. It blew up on him. Just this really crazy conflict of, not only was he basically kidnapped by this young guy, John Doe, who was probably mentally ill, and not only was he kidnapped, he had to run down to the shore. Him and his Minnie, they did this awful escape through the snow, 20 miles to Hovland, and then the local law enforcement refused to adequately help Kugler, and this went on for weeks. And the sheriff did make one trip up, but they did not find John Doe. There are just all these crazy wrinkles. Like, John Doe at other times had appeared with a friend of his, a partner, who was known as the Russian. Like, nobody knows who the Russian was. there were these two guys, both rumored to be Army deserters, and they were robbing people. They were breaking into trappers' cabins. And what happened to the Russian? It's lost to history. That's why I was really hoping that the transcripts from Kugler's trial were still out there, because there may have been testimony as to who this Russian was. And there were also some really bizarre claims in the newspaper, how Minnie Kugler's second wife, who was from Iowa, whom he met through a matrimonial ad in the newspaper, she claimed in court that John Doe was somebody she had met in Iowa and who had murdered a friend of hers. At least that's what the newspapers report. And I mean, whether that's feasible, it doesn't really seem like it. But it's just all these crazy high drama threads in the story. And another cool thing about Kugler is, I mean, this was in the early 1900s, in an era where people did not value wilderness and nature for nature's sake. Nature is more this obstacle and opportunity to make money. And there was still lots of it. In 1900 in the USA, I mean, there would have been just vast expanses of remaining wilderness all around the country. Whereas Kugler had this weird thing where he just wanted to go off into the woods. He liked to be in the woods by himself. He liked to paddle. He liked the experience in a way that is really evocative of why so many people come to the Boundary Waters today. He had sort of that mentality that he wanted to go to wild places back before that was a thing millions of Americans were doing. And Rutstrom had the same drive, which was kind of a neat link between the two of them. Rutstrom was this early American nature writer who espoused on the inherent value of wild places back before such a value was acknowledged as a mainstream idea.
Before Sigurd Olson.
Yeah, and just like, I think as wild places became increasingly scarce, scarcity drives value, I suppose, and people lived on farms and they moved to cities, and after a time them or their kids, they missed that connection to the natural world they'd once had. And of course the Boundary Waters is a place where you can still get that connection without any of with few of the accoutrements of modern society.
And you wrote about you wanting to understand your connection, so you were following in that in some pathway or process as well. Did you learn anything about why you are drawn to this place or these types of places?
I mean, maybe on a more instinctual level. I mean, I don't know that there is a real organized set of reasons that one can chart out for being drawn to such places. I think it's more about the, craving the experiences had there, and in that sense, researching Kugler was a good excuse to go visit the Boundary Waters and have such experiences. I think it's one of those things where it's hard to explain. It's easy to do and live out.
What's it like being here today, coming back after the story's published?
We found more than I had found in May. I was happy about that. I don't know. I did not see. We found that circular rock ring, and that was definitely cool. And we did find the cornerstones, the perpendicular cornerstones that I would assume are Kugler's. Are the remains from Kugler's main cabin. Plus, we found those two trees, an old pine, an old cedar, that were definitely in the Howard Green photograph from the early 1900s. So that's really cool to put those connections together, to see these trees that were alive and fairly old and in the 1900s, and see that they're still going fairly strong.
I want to say a wholehearted thank you to Ryan Rodgers for seeing the value of the work that we do here at Paddle and Portage, and so graciously and eagerly sharing his gifts with this paddling community and this platform. Also, say thank you to all the listeners of this podcast, all the folks who are subscribing to the Paddle and Portage platform. We appreciate you. We do this for you. I'm sure you're sick of me saying this, but I can't say it enough how grateful we are. And thanks to our sponsors who believe in the work that we do and help make it happen.
That's right. I mean, we've had a big boost as we're winding down the first year for Paddle and Portage, getting the word from the team at Canoecopia that we're the official media partner for Canoecopia 2025. We're going to be talking a lot about that at the start of the year, and we'll obviously be there in Madison in a new way and in a capacity that we haven't been, a more robust fashion than last year, where we were just a few months old when we were there last year. So a lot of great things on the horizon, and as we wrap up the first year of Paddle and Portage on the podcast and look forward to year 2, just want to say thanks to everybody that's listened to these episodes. We've had so much fun producing this content, from this trip with Ryan out to Pine to the Ely Challenge episode, the fishing opener,
multiple themes on ice, unrelated themes about sex and intimacy.
The sex episode.
I cannot forget that. And the new updates from the road.
Yeah.
It's been a lot of fun, and you've supported us in being able to really explore that creativity. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and we'll see you in season 2.
Well, you can look to Venus, you can look to Mars. I will set my sights by the northern star, and in the deep dark blue come the northern lights. Oh, and in the deep dark blue come the northern lights. To sing when I paddle canoe, feeling, not thinking if the strokes are true. We're gonna get through to the other side. Out in the night, the waves beat the shore. You can hear them pounding, you can hear them roar. Oh, roll me, rock me in my dreams. You can roll me, rock me in my dreams. So I like to sing, I love to dance. I play the fool if I got the chance. All around the campfire light. All around the campfire light. All round, all round, all round the campfire light.